All right, Shahid, the immediate aftermath of the Taliban attack was astounding military casualties, horrible press for Kabul, the resignation of the country's top two military officials, and U.S. Secretary of Defense James Mattis rushing to Afghanistan on an unannounced emergency visit and hinting at a troop surge. In view of all of this, how successful was this attack, and what do you think the Taliban will do next?
Look, Andrew, if you look at from the perspective of the Afghan Taliban, in my opinion, it was a highly successful attack because it not only sent the national unity government in Kabul into disunity, it basically sabotaged the government. Two of the highest ranking officials in the defense ministry, they had to leave the government. They had to leave the positions. And the second aspect of this attack was that it also sent the United States into panic, and they had to send General James Mattis to come down and reassure the Afghans of their support. So if you carefully study this attack, and I've been following it as soon as it happened on Friday, it's a psychological impact. So yes, there are a lot of casualties. It's a massive attack. Some are citing nearly 200 casualties. And its major effect is psychological. It's demoralizing an already demoralized military. The Afghan National Army is suffering from enormous battlefield casualties. Battlefield attrition rate is very high. Desertion rate is very high. So the psychological impact of this attack alone is quite significant. The second most important element of this particular attack is that the Afghan Taliban, they are looking for a quote-unquote capture and control strategy. They already control about 40 to 50% of the territory, which is the highest percentage of Afghan territory held after the 2001 invasion of Afghanistan. So they're very emboldened at this point in time. They feel that they can exert power. So if you look at the trend, in my opinion, and in my analysis, I would say that the Taliban are not looking for any more spectacular attacks after this particular attack. So they will focus their strategy on capturing and controlling territory, gaining their influence, and also at the same time leveraging their battlefield success on the political arena with the national unity government.
Okay, well, I mean, we know that the U.S. is deliberating on a so-called troop surge. So how feasible do you think it is that the Pentagon will actually go through with this proposal? And Shahid, if they do, how large of a force do you think they'll commit, and what effect could it have on altering the course of the war?
Look, Andrew, we've been discussing this troop surge for a while. This is not really a new proposal. If you remember, Senator John McCain, when he visited Pakistan last year, and he was taken to North Waziristan Agency, and during his interview, he clearly mentioned that he wanted some kind of military presence in Afghanistan for the long term, if not permanent. So some kind of troop surge was already on the mind of strategic thinkers in Pakistan or in the region. One thing we need to make clear here that what the troop surge actually means. So if your objective, and I'm talking about the United States here, if you want to win the war in Afghanistan, you have to bring in at least 200 to 250,000 troops in Afghanistan in order to undo the advances made by the Afghan Taliban and the encroachment done by the Pakistani Taliban in Afghanistan after they were defeated. And now they have rebranded themselves as the quote-unquote ISIS Khorasan in bordering provinces of Afghanistan. So I would say that if the Americans are looking for a troop surge, it's not going to be more than a peacekeeping force. Their only objective is going to be servicing and maintaining the American interests in Afghanistan, to preserve their interests, to preserve the investments they have and the sources of influence they have cultivated in Afghanistan, and to keep the national unity government in power. So I would say roughly, it's very hard to put a number on it, but according to our projection, it cannot be more than 8,000 to 12,000 soldiers. It wouldn't include combat troops as a whole. Like obviously there will be some support staff in that number of troops as well. Its impact on the battlefield situation, therefore, is going to be minimal. As I stated, if you take Pakistan's operations in North Waziristan, for an example, Pakistan had to deploy more than 250,000 troops there in order to get the performance they have been able to get from there. This particular troop surge is a political reassurance to the national unity government, which is increasingly becoming ununited, and they are not really able to work together. and it's not going to be anything more than a peacekeeping force and a reassurance to the Afghan National Army, which is losing on the battlefront. It's extremely demoralized. Look, Americans should have saw it coming because the Afghan National Army was not responsive to training. So it's quite interesting that they decided to leave Afghanistan, and they thought that the Afghan National Army would be able to do the job that they wanted to do, and they could just remotely control everything from Washington. It clearly didn't work out the way they planned.
Yeah, I mean, these are some pretty good points, Shahid. You know, overall, the U.S. military seems to be more focused on Eastern Europe, the Mideast, and East Asia in positioning against Russia, Iran, and China, respectively. And some people think that the war in Afghanistan has been put on the back burner because of this, while others argue that these strategic circumstances have made it all the more important as a result. So, Shahid, my final question to you is, where do you stand on this debate?
Look, this is a very interesting question. And for me to take a position is very hard because the dynamics in Afghanistan are changing exponentially at this point in time. It's a very interesting time in Afghanistan. First thing that I want to say today is that Afghanistan has never been on the priority ever since 2001. In 2003, Americans invaded Iraq, to look for the non-existent weapons of mass destruction. So they had divided priorities, and then the Middle East started to turn into this quote-unquote Arab Spring, and all the reshuffling and redesigning the balance in Middle East started to happen. So now the way I see it is that after the Arab Spring and the Americans also trying to cultivate their influence in so many different regions in Korean Peninsula, in Middle East, in Iraq and Syria. American forces are present in Syria as well. So in my opinion, in Afghanistan, this is the beginning of the second great game. I know it's a very big statement to make, but I would back it up because you have to understand that the instability-stability paradigm in Afghanistan is quite interesting because the instability in Afghanistan, it actually justifies the American military presence and occupation of Afghanistan. And they are now trying to preserve the influence they have cultivated since 2001 in Afghanistan, and it has very little to do with Afghanistan itself. It has very little to do with the Afghan Taliban. I mean, it's quite interesting. Why don't you allow the second faction of the Afghan civil war to assimilate politically into the government? You have allowed the Northern Alliance to assimilate into a political force and form the quote-unquote national unity government. Why aren't you allowing the second force in the Afghan civil war of the 90s, the Taliban, to assimilate politically? Because if that happens, then America does not have a reason to stay in Afghanistan. And if Afghanistan becomes completely stable, then the United States cannot justify its existence, and it won't be able to manage the regional geopolitics according to its own design. Because if you take the multipolarity, which is led by China and Russia and supported by regional powers like Pakistan and Iran and possibly Turkey, I would say that this is a very interesting chessboard right here because the Americans are finding another new phase of interest in Afghanistan because all the regional countries, they have kind of formed as a soft alliance, and they are moving towards a systematic alliance in the future where they would try to seek some kind of peace resolution in Afghanistan, which actually fits with the regional setting. But the U.S. is now getting reinterested in Afghanistan in order to stop that regional project because that would embolden the multipolarity, which is against the interest of the United States. So that's why Afghanistan is becoming hot at the moment. They're bringing it back in the news. They're talking about a surge. They dropped a massive bomb there. It didn't really do anything, but it did make huge headlines, and all of a sudden everyone was talking about Afghanistan. So it's a very interesting time for Afghanistan, Andrew, and I believe this is the beginning of the second great game, and it would decide the future of our region.
Okay, Shahid, thank you very much for this very deep and enlightening talk, and I was happy to have you on Trendstorm. Thanks again for finding the time to speak to us and to our audience.
Always glad to be here, Andrew. Thank you very much for having me.